Professor Harold Koh on a topic of significant interest, the Trump administration and international law. And I know that he's been reading the Mueller report this afternoon, so I think he's going to add something about that. This lecture, this event, fits squarely within the mission of the law school. And that mission includes reflecting on important matters of broad public interest and the dissemination of ideas about how the law can be a positive force. I want to thank the International Humanist Society for its sponsorship of this event and for making it possible. And before I introduce Professor Koh, I'd like to invite to the podium Mr. Gordon Gamm of the Humanist Society, who will say a few words. Gordon.
We're very fortunate to have Harold Koh, Professor Koh, to be with us today. The Boulder International Humanist Institute is a subsidiary of the American Humanist Association, and the American Humanist Association is establishing its own organization, the Humanist Legal Society, which we're just beginning to open up new chapters at law schools around the country as an alternative to several of the other organizations in law school. Some people ask us what humanism is, and humanism is a belief system that has its foundation in the Enlightenment, which is the same as the people who wrote our Constitution, and so we have a lot in common with the American Constitution. In fact, I tell people that an expression of humanist morality is expressed in the preamble to the Constitution. That is, it's a belief that the collective conscience of people have the capacity for making value choices and creating a more perfect union by serving the criteria of serving the general interest. And that's a pretty good indication of how humanists approach value decisions. And that was the basis for the revolutionaries revolting against a king whose basis was on claims that he had the right to speak for God as an inherited right. So that's all I'll say about humanism. You can find magazines in the bookstores called the Humanist Magazine, and there's another one called the Free Inquiry if you want to know more about it. But it's very much in keeping with rational approach to decision-making and human-centered decision-making that we've decided to sponsor this event today, and so glad to have all of you here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Gordon. It's now my pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker. We're deeply honored to have with us Harold Hongju Koh, the Sterling Professor of International Law at Yale Law School. For many of you, Professor Koh needs no introduction. In addition to his service at Yale, both as a professor and a former dean of that law school, Professor Koh has also served as Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor during the Clinton administration, and as the State Department's legal advisor under the Obama administration. He's argued before the United States Supreme Court and international tribunals, testified before Congress multiple times, advised former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton on a wide range of legal issues affecting the country in the international realm, and written 9 books and monographs, as well as over 200 law review articles. And these are just a few of his many accomplishments. Professor Koh is without a doubt one of our nation's foremost experts on international law and human rights, and is someone deeply committed to principled policy and decision-making, and I can attest that he is an excellent human being. His latest book, The Trump Administration and International Law, published in 2018, explores President Trump's distinctive America First approach to foreign policy and the effect it has had in the U.S. and the world. Despite this focus, in a recent New Yorker magazine review, journalist and lawyer Jeffrey Toobin describes the book as written in an optimistic vein and an extension of what he refers to as Professor Koh's improbably sunny demeanor, given his field of study. In his book, Professor Koh places the Trump administration policy within the context of what he calls transnational legal process, and he analyzes how that process has, in some cases, blunted the effects of certain of his administration's policies and actions. With this lecture, we have the chance to learn from an expert how events unfolding daily in our own country may play out in the broader context of the international legal system. Please join me in welcoming to the podium Professor Harold Koh. Welcome.
Well, thank you so much, Jim. I've been having a Rocky Mountain high in my few hours here. It's great to be here. It's my first time in Boulder, although my son lived near Pueblo for about a year working on a wolf preserve, so we feel very fondly toward the state of Colorado. I feel especially fondly toward Jim Anaya, who has been a friend and role model in my field for many years. I had the chance to work with him when I was Assistant Secretary for Human Rights, and then to argue before him when I was legal advisor to the State Department. And I'm very grateful to Gordon Gamm and the Humanist Society for welcoming me here as well. I couldn't say more in support of the notion of the need for rational decision-making and humanist consideration, which is very much at issue in our country today. And was confirmed to me even more by my afternoon, which was spent reading and trying to digest for you the Mueller report. As Jim described, my life has broken into 4 streams: as a law professor, a dean, a human rights lawyer, and 12 years in the U.S. government. Please don't add these up. As we say in our business, some of these sentences ran concurrently. In my time in government, many things happened. This is the most famous picture of me, which for some reason was on the backs of buses. It was a very simple story. We were about to fly into Tripoli after the fall of Gaddafi from Malta, and they got us a very large military transport that had a big open space, but then they put in some nicer seats, and I was the second ranking guy on the plane, so we got on, but then they got on to take pictures of us, and it was a little awkward. So I texted to Secretary Clinton, "Look over your shoulder." That's what she's actually reading. Not Who Run the World Girls, although it would certainly be better if they did. Now, if you can imagine, because of this relationship, I did not vote for our current president. I did expect him to uphold his oath of office, which is to uphold the Constitution and laws of the United States of America. That's an oath I took 5 times and that I take extremely seriously. He has not done so, and it has been a very shocking experience to witness over the last 2 years his disruption of law and his disruption of international law. The question now is whether his strategy could permanently change the nature of our relationship with international law and institutions and with our allies. And secondly, a question of whether there's a counter strategy that those of us who would like to preserve the rule of law should apply. Of my latest book, The Trump Administration and International Law. I was asked by a prominent judge, what's your thesis in 3 words or less? And the answer was, he's not winning. He's not winning. Jeff Toobin and others considered them to be a optimistic message. How do we know? I try to do the anatomy of a struggle across a number of issue areas. Why isn't he winning? because of this counter strategy of resistance and action. And then the bigger question, what's really at stake, which is much more than Donald Trump, who is, I hope, a passing phenomenon. And so the book closes with a call to action, which it will be the same call to action with which I end the lecture tonight. If you're interested, there are flyers about the book, and I think they even provide a way where you can buy it more cheaply. I think that it's actually listed now under the Mueller report. In case you want to download both at the same time, that's okay by me. What is the counter strategy? Well, in my academic career, I have argued for many years that there is something called transnational legal process. Maybe the most simple way to put it was the day after the election, one of my students, very distraught, said, I want Trump to lose, but I want America and the world to win. Is that possible? And I said, yes, it is possible, because the law is a lot bigger than Donald Trump. But it means that the rest of us who want to preserve the law have to deploy ourselves, enter the fight, whether allies, states, localities, bureaucracy, the media, courts, non-governmental organizations, intergovernmental organizations, or just as committed individuals like you in the Humanist Society, to provoke interactions, namely challenges, that lead to interpretations of international law that can then be internalized into our domestic conduct. What this will end up doing is creating sticky default patterns of law-abiding behavior that even a willful executive like Donald Trump can't so easily discard. Now, to be clear, this is both descriptive. It is a description of what has been happening for the last 2.5 years and an explanation as to why less damage has been done than has been attempted. But it's also a prescription for how those of us who want to get involved can participate. And to be clear, it's also an inside strategy and an outside strategy. From the outside, as a human rights activist, I've tried to engage in interact, interpretation, and internalization. But from the inside, when you are a government official, you try to promote the rule of law by applying what I would call international law as smart power: engage, translate, and leverage. This approach means when in doubt, the United States should engage with our allies around common values. When in doubt, we should try to translate from existing rules to contemporary situations. So, for example, the Geneva Conventions of 1949 never mentioned cyberspace, but cyber war is going on. You could either say it's a black hole where no rules apply, or you could try to translate the spirit of the laws of war to cyber conflict. And then from the core of a legal solution, try to leverage that into a sustaining diplomatic solution to a problem. I want to argue that it's the combination of this outside pressure and inside observance for the rule of law that has largely blunted Trump's efforts to disrupt the rule of law. It's become the counter strategy for effective resistance. Now, this might be a little academic, so in lay terms, what it is rope-a-dope. For those of you who remember the greatest prize fight of modern times, Muhammad Ali seemed to be completely outmanned by George Foreman. So what he did was, in the first round, he went to the ropes and let Foreman flail away at him and punch at him. He, meanwhile, counterpunched, conserved his own energy, taunted his opponent, and then when Foreman was completely exhausted from all of his wild swinging, in the 8th round, Ali came off the ropes and knocked him out. The reason I mention this is essentially what the other players have been doing to the Trump administration. They have been checking him by enduring a fair amount of punishment, yes, to be sure, but on the other hand, counterpunching and checking his initiatives with energy in such a way that he wears himself out and doesn't promote initiatives that advance his party's chance for re-election. And in the 7th round in Zaire, at that famous fight, if you had asked most observers who's winning, they would have said Foreman. In fact, Ali was about to knock him out the next round. I think today, with the Mueller report, could be yet another step closer to that outcome. Now, where did this smart power notion, international law of smart power, come from? You can think of it as the Obama-Clinton doctrine. Obama said we believe in a smarter kind of leadership where we combine military power with diplomacy and leverage our power with coalitions. In other words, engage, translate, and leverage. Hillary Clinton, both as secretary and as a candidate, used smart power, including respect for law and human rights, to achieve certain outcomes. Why do I mention this? Because Trump's doctrine is the opposite: disengage wherever possible, namely a unilateralist America First approach. He does not translate international law to modern situations. He says we should act based on our national interest. And he doesn't leverage. He would go it alone without a diplomatic strategy or respect for the rule of law. Now, it's a little strong to talk about Trump having a strategy. He acts based on impulse. But the thrust of those impulses are pretty clear. Wherever possible, reverse what Obama did and what he thought Clinton would have done, to take an isolationist hard power posture, to withdraw from global leadership, to undermine international institutions, and wherever possible to make extreme claims of presidential power citing national security. His means are equally clear. He would denigrate expertise and knowledge, particularly in the area of climate change. He would diminish diplomacy. He would gut career bureaucracy. He challenged the media as fake news. He demands deference, but his most fundamental tactic is to flood the zone. Any number of the things that he's done are so outrageous, you wouldn't believe them, except that they're only one of 5 things he does a day. And so you forget. I mean, he's been separating children from their parents at the border for weeks. But somehow our outrage at that has ebbed just because he says something else that's even more shocking. Now, to be fair, this strategy reflects a deeper diagnosis. And that diagnosis is simple. Our relationship with the world is zero-sum. Globalization has made the middle class worse off. The United States has lost competitiveness. Immigrants and allies must be the problem. We should forget the liberal orthodoxy of diversity, inclusion, and multiculturalism. And to make America great again, the U.S. should resign from world leadership. That's his philosophy. But let me suggest that this approach has been blunted, and the counter strategy has been implemented across a range of areas, which I discuss in my book: immigration and refugees, human rights, climate change, Iran, North Korea, Russia and hacking the election, which is really what the Mueller report was about, Ukraine, the Islamic State, and Syria. Now, you may not agree with what I'm going to say in any particular area, but the whole point is to paint a broad brush rather than just focus on one area. So you see how this general struggle is playing out across the range of international law. So let's start with Trump's signature policy, immigration. The travel bans, 1, 2, and 3, attacks on sanctuary cities. His latest notion is to weaponize detainees by releasing them into sanctuary cities. What could be less of a focus on a humanistic approach or human rights than to treat, immigrants as objects or weapons? To build a wall, which of course won't work, to demonize a caravan, to focus on border control. His real approach is shock and awe. His effort is to try to scare people to encourage their self-deportation. The astonishing decision to separate children from their parents, may that go on the tombstone of Kirsten Nielsen in time. She separated parents from their children. No one should forget that. To end birthright citizenship, you know, my parents were aliens when I was born in the United States. That's how I became an American. It's in the Constitution, yet he would eliminate it. To end DACA, namely Dreamers, and deport them. To have immigration based on skills. To treat refugees as terrorists, even though, as human rights lawyers know, they're the favorite of human rights law. To show hostility to the courts, so he would call courts unable to protect us against bad hombres. He would call someone a Mexican judge who was born in the United States. And perhaps most shocking of all, his willingness to bomb for Syrian children. So he says, but he won't admit those same children into the United States. Now, what was the response? It all began back in January 2017. We were there, that's my wife, my daughter, and me. My son was marching in a different city. We went to Washington, we were in a hotel during what they called the largest inauguration of all time. Not. But the next day, there genuinely were millions of people in the streets in New York, DC, and everywhere else chanting, "This is what democracy looks like." But then came executive orders, the travel ban, 7 days later, directed against people from Muslim-majority countries. Now, from the beginning, we knew this was bad law. Obviously, it violates the international human rights law. It also violates the First Amendment because it singles out people based on their religion and interferes with their free exercise and would establish other religions as ones deserving governmental support. It's absurd politics. Why? It's what lawyers call over and under inclusive. Not a single one of the countries on the Muslim ban list had produced a terrorist who had committed a lethal act in the previous 40 years. Let me say that again. There had never been a lethal terrorist attack from anyone from a country that was on the list. Yet there are countries not on the list, most prominently Saudi Arabia, which had produced many people who had participated in terrorist attacks, like the 9/11 terrorists. I mean, you can wonder why Saudi Arabia got itself off the list. And then Trump started saying we need a system of extreme vetting. That was the system we had, extreme individualized vetting. We would evaluate, and when I was in the government, we evaluated terrorist threats based on people and what they had done, not based on stereotypes, based on their religion. It was a terrible process. It had not been seen by any members of his cabinet. It was a terrible piece of economics. In the first year, it cost us almost $2 billion. So my students and I had started something which we called the Rule of Law Clinic at Yale. It has since, essentially without funding or support, filed more than 50 briefs in these cases. We originally represented the following people. Former Secretaries of State Madeleine Albright, a native of Colorado, John Kerry, Leon Panetta, Janet Napolitano, 4 heads or deputy heads of the CIA, including 2 Republicans, Susan Rice, the former National Security Advisor, and her 2 deputies. And we made a very simple factual argument, which is there is no national security threat. How did we know? A lot of these people were in the government 6 days earlier. They were reviewing the classified information stream. There was no threat. Trump made it up for the purpose of launching a discriminatory ban. So what happened next? The bureaucracy revolted. This is part of the inside strategy: engage, translate, and leverage. The bureaucracy doesn't do what the president wants. And that's one of the major messages of the Mueller report. The State Department, where I used to work, has a mechanism called the dissent channel cable. That allows people who disagree with the policy to sign a document. Here, I'd never seen one with more than 10 names. Within a day, 1,000 of my former colleagues said, "We are better than this." The Justice Department was amazingly never asked whether they would defend the legality of the ban. It turned out they wouldn't. And so the acting Attorney General, Sally Yates, was asked to resign. How about lawyers? Members of the Yale Law School clinic went to JFK Airport, where one of their clients, an Iraqi interpreter who had served American soldiers, taken his own life at risk to interpret for American soldiers in Iraq, was blocked coming in, even though he had a green card. And so what they did was they filed a class action habeas motion and uploaded the templates for such similar habeas motions onto the World Wide Web. 4,000 volunteer lawyers across America went to the airports, and they downloaded our students' templates and began showing them to immigration officials and getting their clients in. The Uber drivers, Lyft drivers, and taxi drivers who took them to the airports joined the demonstrations, and pretty soon the airports had become scenes for candlelight vigils, and the very demonstrations that had been happening on the streets of Washington, New York, had suddenly shifted to the airports. Meanwhile, the military was protesting. The head of the Iraqi Joint Chiefs said, "I'm a four-star who fought alongside American soldiers, and I can't come to the United States." Tech companies, and you have many here in Colorado, 163 of them filed a brief protecting tech workers. The Koch brothers, Dick Cheney and John Yoo, let me say that again. The Koch brothers, Dick Cheney and John Yoo, all said, "This is too much for us." And so, after 20 courts had ruled against Travel Ban 1.0, it was withdrawn, and they substituted Travel Ban 2.0. But the legal process did not stop. Our allies all engaged Trump and pushed back. Republican members of Congress criticized the ban. 15 state attorney generals resisted. 47 universities filed. The agencies revolted. The bureaucracy leaked draft documents opposing the position. Culture. The Museum of Modern Art exhibited arts of individuals from the excluded countries. This is where Alec Baldwin's portrayal of Trump revived his career. Stephen Colbert, Seth Meyers, Jimmy Kimmel all took on the issue. I didn't used to drink Budweiser, I drank Coors. But then I found out from a Super Bowl commercial that Budweiser was actually made by an immigrant. So now, against my will, I drink Budweiser. This became a huge sensation on social media. Marches were held on a whole range of issues: climate, science, a day without immigrants. You couldn't get a meal in New York for less than 4 hours. A day without women, nothing happened anywhere. The Travel Ban 2.0 then came along, but it was also withdrawn. At this point, we were up to 49 former officials with our clinic. We basically made the point, as Bill Clinton would put it, it doesn't matter how much lipstick you put on that pig, it's still a pig. It doesn't matter what you call a Muslim ban, it's still a Muslim ban. We said, more lipstick, same pig. We said it hurt our troops, it hurt our counterterrorism efforts, it hurt law enforcement, it hurt jobs. Well, you know what happened next? The Supreme Court finally upheld Travel Ban 3.0 in a really outrageous decision by Chief Justice Roberts. He said that this had nothing to do with the Japanese internment. Korematsu has nothing to do with this case. Well, if you believe that, I've got a travel ban to sell you, which is what they did. But the error was very simple. In this country, we judge individuals by the content of their character, not by the color of their skin or group stereotypes or what country they're from or who they worship. You know, John Roberts just never addressed that issue. But it's not over. People think the travel ban case is over. The legal process is continuing. After all, you cannot transit from one of these Muslim countries to the United States without going through Europe, and the European Court of Human Rights has a number of challenges with regard to whether those countries can support the ban. All they did was say that they would not grant a preliminary injunction because it wasn't unconstitutional on its face, but it could be unconstitutional as applied, and they're now in discovery to assess that issue. And then the other day, a group of senators and members of the House introduced legislation to reverse the travel ban by statute. So that may still happen. Now, obviously, in the middle of all of this, who gets appointed to the Supreme Court with great controversy, but my former student, Brett Kavanaugh. Obviously, he's far to the right of Justice Kennedy. I have to say that he made the greatest mistake. He, like Bill Barr today, tried to please an audience of one, when in fact he should have been telling the country why he deserved to be a Supreme Court justice. Merrick Garland, who will not be a Supreme Court justice, always acted like a Supreme Court justice. At the critical moment, Brett Kavanaugh didn't. And even though he'll be on the Supreme Court, he'll never persuade people that he should be a Supreme Court justice. What I think he might actually do, and this is a guess, is he still has the national emergency case to come. And I have a feeling that Brett Kavanaugh might well vote against Trump on that. Why? Because it's one of the few ways that he can clear his name in his first year that was set by his testimony against Blasey Ford. I also think that John Roberts cares very much about the reputation of the Roberts Court. And I think he is a good bet also to vote against the claim of national emergency. And you only need one of them for the national emergency to be struck. And there are 6 cases that are already being filed, and I can tell you more about them in the Q&A. My point is very simple. Trump's immigration strategy is constantly being checked by law. The zero tolerance policy, outrageous policy of separating children from their parents, 2 judges disagreed and have essentially brought that policy to a standstill, although there have been countless separations and extraordinary human pain. Trump then switched to argue that birthright citizenship should be eliminated, except that the 14th Amendment, the law says, all persons born in the U.S. are citizens. So they didn't do that. They then said they wouldn't permit asylum applications between ports of entry, except there's a statute that says you can claim asylum whether at or between ports of entry. So that's also illegal. Now, Bill Barr, among other activities a few days ago, signed an order in which he said that asylum seekers have to wait in Mexico. And it has 90 days to go into effect. They're already in court trying to block it. And then finally, in what the Congress called the first time in memory that the president has declared a national emergency to circumvent Congress's unwillingness to appropriate for one of his purposes, they let it go. Why? So they could reopen the government. but the litigation is proceeding. Now, you might ask, how much does he really care? After all, he's not a person who has sustained or detailed interest. He might just prefer to check the box and move on. He's holding together a very fragile coalition of Trumpites, but traditional Republicans. Those traditional Republicans are starting to abandon him. They voted against him, about 13 of them on the national emergency. A number voted against him, most recently on his veto of the War Powers Bill on Yemen. Every piece of political capital he spends on this makes his core agenda harder, particularly his efforts to replace Obamacare, which he's now backing a long-shot constitutional challenge, which will almost surely fail. What about human rights? Think back, this man was Secretary of State. It's hard to believe. He was fired by tweet. After, in a very short period of time, showing he simply did not understand the role of human rights in U.S. foreign policy. When asked about Duterte of the Philippines, and his policy of summary executions, Tillerson said, "I'm not ready to judge." The Secretary of State of the United States is not ready to judge whether summary executions are bad. He's never engaged on human rights. He never spoke out for our values, particularly in the Middle East, in all of these countries. And we're surprised that the Saudis then went on to murder Jamal Khashoggi. He gutted the career foreign service. He tried to remove the words democracy and human rights from the State Department's mission statement. I was Assistant Secretary for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. So it was essentially gutting the portfolio of my own agency. They withdrew from the Human Rights Council. They have attacked the International Criminal Court. And then human rights was downplayed in the summits with North Korea, the outrageous case of Otto Warmbier, about which I'll say more. But what about the issue of waterboarding and torture? During the campaign, Trump said, of course torture works and we'll use waterboarding a hell of a lot worse. The problem is that torture was forbidden by the policy of the Obama administration that was formalized on December 2016. Congress has forbidden torture by treaty and statute. The Geneva Conventions forbid torture, and so does the Torture Convention, which says no exceptional circumstances may be applied whatsoever, whether a state of war or a threat of war. Now, when I was Assistant Secretary of Human Rights, I testified before Congress, and one senator said, "Professor," as Jim knows, when you're testifying, being called professor is not a term of respect. It's ivory tower. Last time I checked, he said, Al-Qaeda hasn't signed the Torture Convention. And I said, you know what, Senator, last time I checked, the whales haven't signed the Whaling Convention either. What's the point? We don't do this as a matter of contract. This is a unilateral, minimal, humane standard of treatment. This is not about us and them and who they are. It's about us and who we are. Who said that? The late John McCain. Whether we obey a torture ban is more about us and who we are. So why no torture being reported in the Trump administration? Because these people, they have their problems. Each one of them testified that they would not execute a torture order that violates the laws of the United States of America. And even though Mattis, Kelly, and Sessions are gone, Haspel at the CIA, Pompeo, and Barr are still there. You can't order torture if no one's going to implement it. That, again, is the message of today's Mueller report. What about climate? The Paris Climate Agreement shows the important strategy that Trump has adopted, which I call resigning without leaving. we used engage, translate, and leverage, namely international law, smart power, to enter this extraordinary historic agreement. Trump tried to withdraw in June 2017, but here's the catch. There's law. Trump is not bigger than law. He's following the terms of the Paris Agreement, which say he cannot even file a notice to leave until November of this year. And then there's another year before he can actually leave. That's November 4th, 2020. If you've been keeping track, the next presidential election is November 3rd, 2020. Now, some people say, well, he's preemptively withdrawn. He's done nothing of the kind. I could tell you, I intend to leave my job in November 2020, and then I get there and I say, guess what? I'm not going to do it. So what he's done has the legal force of a tweet. His default is not leaving. It's staying in and underperforming or being a lame duck. And that is what makes you powerless within an international organization. Well, Scott Pruitt said leave. He left first. If we try to withdraw from the Paris Agreement without congressional participation, he will get sued. I've just written a law review article about this in the Yale Law Journal. If we try to undo the Clean Power Plan, which implements the Paris Agreement, it will be litigated for years. Other players are compensating. We're still in. You know, we were in arrears of our UN dues for a number of years, but we made it up. So once again, Trump doesn't own climate change. We all do. And if we fight for it, as they say in Casablanca, we'll always have Paris. What about trade diplomacy? A George W. Bush economist said, Trump thought if the U.S. had stopped, the process would come to a halt. It just moved on without us. He withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which the U.S. designed and Trump abandoned. The other 11 countries joined it anyway. It's up and running. Now Trump is applying to join it. It's like that old song. They all laughed at Rockefeller Center. Now they're trying to get in. There are 35 trade pacts under consideration. The U.S. is party to just one of them. Who's suffering? American ranchers, because Canadians and Australians can sell more cheaply in Japan because they're inside the tariff wall. Trump said trade wars are good and easy to win. They're not. And so, take a look. He tried to renegotiate a deal with South Korea on free trade, forgetting that he needs them on North Korea. They renegotiated, and the Koreans won. And then he said he would renegotiate the U.S. NAFTA. He's renamed it the MCA. You could ask, why MCA? Or, as some people call it, the Ushmaka. The whole Mishpucha made the Ushmaka, as we Koreans say. Well, guess what? It hasn't been approved. And more fundamentally, if you look at it, what is it? It's the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The agreement that Trump is touting is the one that he walked away from. What about the Iran nuclear deal? He says it's the worst agreement in history. Engage, translate, and leverage. Among other things, it reduced Iran's enriched uranium stockpiles by 98% and guaranteed us robust monitoring of their nuclear activities with International Atomic Energy Inspection. And the International Atomic Energy Agency has now certified 12 times that Iran is complying. That's not the worst deal in history. If Trump could get an eighth of that with North Korea, you wouldn't hear the end of it. Now, he resigned, but the Iran nuclear deal continues. It's fragile, but it's working. The other parties have no reason to leave. We have no leverage to renegotiate. Many Israelis see it as better than the alternative, which is Iran building a bomb. The Republicans don't want to get rid of it because they have no alternative. And here's the catch. Many in the Trump administration want to preserve the Iran deal. Why? Because if we walk from the Iran deal, why would North Korea ever enter a denuclearization deal with us? We just walked away from the last one we did. And what's actually happening, my friends at the State Department tell me, is that the North Korea negotiators for the US are going to these negotiations with provisions from the Iran nuclear deal. So any negotiations are simply smuggling back into the North Korea discussion the very provisions of what Trump calls the worst deal in history. Now, obviously, this is at a level of detail that is below Trump's notice. How about fire and fury, North Korea? I take this very seriously. I am a Korean American. My mother was in North Korea when the country was first divided. It was only by a miracle that she escaped. Trump threatened initially to show fire and fury like the world has never seen, and said he would end the country. End the country, a country of 28 million people. In other words, kill civilians. And then he said, when Tillerson, in one of Tillerson's few good moves, said, let's negotiate, he said, Tillerson's foolish to negotiate. Then Trump negotiated. Now, I went to North Korea 3 times. I went with Madeleine Albright for 5 days in 2000. It is hard to imagine a more badly handled diplomatic negotiation than we've had with North Korea. It has been a complete disaster. Why? Because our starting point with President Clinton was, you never let a tin pot dictator like Kim Jong-il or Kim Jong-un be photographed with the President of the United States unless they have made all of the concessions up front, unless they have destroyed the weapons, unless they have released the political prisoners. Trump went to the summit with no plan and got taken to the cleaners. Now, Kim is a smart person. He looks funny, but he's smart. He knew, I'm entering into a poker game with America. I'm going to put chips on the table, which is I will escalate, build weapons. And then the mountain he's testing them in breaks. So then he says, I'm going to de-escalate and put more chips on the table by getting credit for de-escalating. And then he has a standard move. He arrests people for absolutely no reason. And when Trump appeared, he released them. Now, you don't give somebody credit for that. If I arrested all of you, and then when Trump appeared, I released you, you would hope that he would notice that you had not been arrested before. Instead, Trump said, they were released because of me. Yeah, they were arrested because of you also. Then he agreed to a declaration moving toward denuclearization. That means nothing. I'm moving this toward you. Now I'm moving it back. It commits to nothing. He did it on a handshake. He never specified what it meant. What it actually meant is that Trump is accepting 60 nuclear weapons in North Korea. In the Iran nuclear deal, there are no nuclear weapons. He is condoning the existence of nuclear weapons. And so now the New York Times reports we're back to square one. Mike Pence got involved and said the era of strategic patience is over. What does this mean? We're in an era of strategic impatience? There is no military option. And now Trump is in love. He said, I'm in love. When I went to North Korea in 2000, our intelligence briefing showed me a satellite map in which there were dozens of black spaces. And I said, what are those? And they said, those are labor camps where people are living without food, subjected to hard labor and being regularly tortured. And I said, how big is that one? And he said, sir, that is the size of the District of Columbia. And I said, how many people live there? He said, we don't know for sure, but at least 1 million. And that was one of only about 60 labor camps. He's in love with this person. But the Singapore Declaration promises far less than the Iran nuclear deal. As talks progress, he would be lucky to get half, an eighth of what is in the Iran nuclear deal that he just walked away from. And then the Hanoi summit, one of the great diplomatic disasters of recent times. Trump went, and then he walked. He announced it because after the shutdown, he wanted to have something to announce at the State of the Union address. They went without planning. Any lawyer here knows you never enter a negotiation in which there are only two options. You get everything you want, or you walk. There has to be a third option. We're talking about it. We have some sort of statement of joint progress. Walking because the other side is intransigent is not the same as walking because you are grossly unprepared. The President of the United States went into a major summit totally unprepared and then had to walk away. How do you know? Where were the South Koreans? Where was the visit to Seoul? Where were the Japanese? Where was the multilateralism? And now Trump would like to have another summit. One-on-one summits are not good. This would be like my saying, great news, I'm going to play one-on-one again with LeBron James. He cleaned my clock the last 2 times, so I'm very eager to do it again. Having a summit is not progress. And there's no discussion. It turns out the North Koreans have declined full disclosure. And then when his staff prepared sanctions, Trump just canceled them. He did not get any kind of trade, even the most basic one, which is the decommissioning of the Yongbyon nuclear power plant. As you saw today, Kim Jong-un is now testing new weapons. Why? So he can give them up. And then Trump will say, see, we're making progress. That's the way they do it. They move the goalposts and then they move them back. And then most disgusting and shocking of all, does anybody here really believe that if the North Koreans wanted to disrupt America, that they would use an intercontinental ballistic nuclear missile? No. They'd use cyber disruption. How do we know? They already did it. They took down Sony because of a bad movie starring Josh Rogan and James Franco, which I nevertheless saw. Terrible, but they took down the entire Sony grid. They took down the National Health Service in Britain with the WannaCry virus, which means that the first words out of the president's mouth when he sees Kim Jong-un should be, do not touch our grid. That's not what he said. And then, when asked, what about Otto Warmbier, who in fact had been sort of the cause of the summit, Trump said, Kim doesn't know anything about it, and I took him at his word. Really. And now what are we back to? Strategic patience, multilateral diplomacy, deterrence, containment, and sanctions, cyber sabotage, and the goal is now to build an Iran nuclear deal for North Korea, but call it something else. And then hope Trump doesn't notice. In other words, Trump created a crisis with North Korea by tweeting when he suddenly, by the way, have you seen anything about North Korea recently? He then stopped tweeting about it. And he says, crisis over. This brings us, of course, to the issue of the day, the Russian hack. Trump doesn't know this process either. 17 intelligence agencies and the Senate Intelligence Committee agreed on the assessment. The Russians tried to disrupt our election. The FBI had a counterintelligence probe on this since July 2016, but Jim Comey decided instead to talk about Hillary Clinton's emails. Early on, in one of the 34 indictments issued by Mueller, Russian operatives were indicted for their role on information operations and active measures. So what happened with the Mueller report? Today I read it. Here's a summary. Insufficient evidence of two things: of coordination. They never use the word collusion because it's not a crime. There is no legal. Collusion is a colloquialism. The statement is, the Russian government perceived it would benefit from a Trump presidency, worked to secure that outcome. The campaign expected it would benefit electorally from the information stolen and released, but they couldn't establish that there was conspiracy or coordination as opposed to merely parallel activity. Now, if the Russians are trying to influence the election, you would expect a presidential candidate to report that to the FBI or object. What happened instead was that Trump repeatedly tried to obstruct and block the investigation. The evidence we obtained, this is a direct quote, prevent us from conclusively determining that no criminal conduct occurred. His efforts to influence the investigation were mostly unsuccessful, but that's largely because the persons who surrounded the president declined to carry out orders or accede to his requests. This is amazing. Now, by the way, it could easily lead to the conclusion that he attempted to obstruct justice. That's a criminal charge. His statement is, nobody in my campaign has been charged, and me either. That's because his subordinates blocked him from actually obstructing the investigation. And they go through 10 incidents. In each of them, he gave an order that his subordinates declined to carry out. So again, this is proof that what's holding the guardrails are that individual government officials who swore to uphold the rule of law won't accede to the demands of someone who's not interested in upholding the rule of law. Now, if you haven't read the Mueller report, volume 1 is shocking, but there's a lot of redactions. The Russians interfered in the election in a sweeping and systematic fashion by a social media campaign and computer intrusion operations. They did not establish coordination, but there is extensive evidence of infiltration, and there is no evidence that the Trump campaign ever tried to stop or report this. In fact, he's claiming total exoneration from the fact that he benefited from foreign interference and did absolutely nothing to prevent it. On obstruction, even more clearly, they said, if we had confidence that he didn't commit obstruction, we'd say so. We can't do that. Based on the facts and applicable law, we are unable to reach that judgment. We cannot clear him. And more than that, you can't indict a sitting president. So we leave the evidence for you to determine, and it should be over to Congress to determine whether obstruction occurred and whether to apply constitutional remedies like impeachment, the 25th Amendment, congressional investigations, or others. This is a stunning indictment of unethical campaign behavior. It's not a complete and total exoneration. Now notice that there are 16 ongoing investigations. You can read through the redactions to see the following: that there were at least the possibility of charges of illegal links and coordination, conspiracy to defraud the U.S., particularly by Roger Stone and Don Jr., campaign finance violations. Trump has already been named as individual one in a New York indictment. Emoluments violations, bank, wire, tax, insurance fraud from inflating and deflating assets. Trump said, I had no dealings with the Russians except for the effort to build Trump Tower, Michael Flynn's communication with the ambassador, Maria Butina, the meeting with a Russian lawyer who claimed to have derogatory information which was edited falsely to say it was about Russian adoptions, George Papadopoulos, and finally the issue of WikiLeaks. That's not no dealings. That is extensive dealings and penetration. What does this mean? The Mueller release is the end of the beginning of a devastating display of willingness to accept election interference from a hostile foreign power and an intent to cover up. But there's a long way to go. How will other constitutional remedies intersect? After all, the House must now consider whether he committed constitutional crimes. Mueller said because of the Justice Department indictment policy, non-indictment policy, he could not commit an ordinary crime while sitting president, but left it open for him to be charged after he's president. But that is a different question from whether he committed the constitutional crime of obstructing the operation of another branch or abuse of power. Why does it matter? The hack is like the Watergate burglary. No one claimed that Nixon participated in the Watergate burglary. They said that he had committed an impeachable obstruction by covering it up. Even if Trump didn't know about the Russian activities, if he contrived to use his office to thwart the investigation, the Watergate precedent applies. So the questions are the same. What did the president know and when did he know it? Did he actively participate in the cover-up? To what extent is he compromised for the future? And this is the broader question for foreign policy and international law. Can Trump act objectively toward the Russians, or is he compromised by the extent and nature of his ties, his loans? No collusion doesn't mean no compromise. After all, the disaster in Helsinki showed that he had abandoned all accountability for Russian hacking. In other words, he would have Russian hacking be a regular feature of all elections. He threw his own intelligence agencies under the bus on behalf of Putin. He then had a one-on-one meeting with Putin for 2 hours where everybody knows, only the Kremlin knows what happens. Americans don't. What's strange about it is that it has actually made our Russia policy tougher. Trump is correct when he says, no one has a tougher policy on the Russians than my administration. It's not because of him, it's in spite of him. The Russian hack violated international law. Obama started by expelling diplomats. Congress passed a sweeping sanctions bill. Trump reluctly signed it. He tried to stall its implementation. There was the murder by nerve agents by the Russians of the Salisbury Brits. And so to calm the waters, Pompeo affirmed that the U.S. is opposed to the annexation of Crimea. I mention this because I am a lawyer for Ukraine. We are about to move toward 2 hearings in the International Court of Justice and the Law of the Sea Tribunal against Russia this summer. And the issue will be, can we demonstrate that they acted illegally? We're not doing it with the help of the U.S. government because we won't get help from Trump. What about counterterrorism? Here, Obama had tried to narrow the scope of counterterrorism, saying there's no global perpetual war on terror. He took a lot of flack for drones, but all he said was that they could be an effective tool along with others to dismantle specific networks. He made it clear that drones are a tool, not a strategy. The real strategy is engage, translate, and leverage. Trump has announced unilateral departure from Afghanistan. In the Taliban negotiations, they'll say whatever they want for us to leave. Again, this is bad deal-making. The end point of the negotiations is that the United States leaves. You don't just say, we're leaving, because then they'll say whatever it takes for you to leave. He did the same in Syria. Now, with no substitute, Trump appears to be undoing Obama's counterterrorism plan of integrated targeting and detention, lawful targeting, lawful detention, no torture, and lawful cooperation with states also at war. What about ISIS, finally? Trump said, we're leaving in 120 days. Bolton, his national security advisor, said, we'll leave when it's safe for the Kurds for us to leave and when ISIS is completely destroyed. What nobody notices, he completely reversed Trump's announcement. But the hard power parts of this plan were also the Obama-Clinton parts. We've never announced a soft power, smart power approach to dismantle the network, to discredit the ideology online, to maintain strong alliances. In fact, Trump has been jeopardizing these alliances. And these are the real keys to stopping future attacks, not attacking ISIS. They're not gone. They've simply disappeared into other places like Iraq or Syria or other parts of Africa. What we ought to be aware of is the so-called self-generated 9/11. The United States is at war with al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and associated forces. We're not at war with everyone who hates America. And when someone self-radicalizes, like the Boston Marathon bombers, or take someone who is a Muslim American who's angry about the Muslim ban, and they decide to get into a car, a truck, and drive it down the street of Las Vegas, or to go in with a bump stock and kill people at the Pulse nightclub, that's not a reason to send them to Guantanamo or to a military commission. This is the real reason for Trump's attack on judges, to make people distrust our legal system so that they think that they should give him more power. Ironically, he could close Guantanamo tomorrow. There are only 40-something people there, simply by saying, see, I've done something more than Obama did. But he may be emboldened to use national security masquerades, as Justice Sotomayor put it. In fact, now national security is being invoked as a justification for trade policy, family separation, the transgender ban, the stop-loss program for coal, the wall. To close, what is really at stake? The bigger picture is that we have been following since 1945 the Bretton Woods and UN systems, Immanuel Kant's vision of perpetual peace flowing not from world government, but from a law-governed international society among sovereign states collectively explicating shared moral commitments to human rights and the rule of law. The contrary is George Orwell's 1984, where there is no truth and the great powers scratch each other's back. Because you see, America first misunderstands the world. Our relationship with the world is not zero-sum. Globalization, if properly managed, can make us better off, particularly the middle class. Immigrants and allies are part of the solution. Thinking that we can protect our sovereignty by keeping people out ignores that the real way we exert our sovereignty is by participating in multilateral institutions, which means that the U.S. should lead, not resign from world leadership. So our challenge is to preserve and build this system, not to trash it. But the trends are worrying. Human rights has declined in 2/3 of the countries of the world who are being measured. The rule of law is down in 38 countries. Europe is in a shambles because of Brexit, refugees, and economic stagnation. We see that Trump is less a cause than he is a symptom, that globalization unleashed economic forces, froze wages, forced migration, enhanced inequality, left the middle class furious and betrayed, which has led to the kind of rise of nationalism, authoritarianism, anti-globalism, which attacks reason, decision-making, and humanist values. And the new global authoritarians all share the same playbook: Bolsonaro of Brazil, Xi Jinping, Duterte, Maduro, Trump, Erdogan, Putin. They attack courts, they reject diversity, they demonize immigrants, they cow legislators, they disparage bureaucrats, they attack the media, they reward their cronies, and they claim that the will of the people must override the Constitution. But breaking up is hard to do. We're part of many multilateral regimes. Exiting is not immediate or easy. People want what these regimes offer, like clean energy. We can fix these problems of underperformance down the road. And none of these exits is really part of his core agenda, so if we make it hard, he might move on. But will these multilateral regimes suffer lasting damage? This is the other side of what happened to Muhammad Ali. He took such a beating that he came unglued. And our alliances are strained, our bureaucracy is demoralized, the media is exhausted, as are we. We aren't making progress when Brexit and Trump are sapping our energy, and the leadership vacuum is being filled by Russia and China. So will Donald Trump international law? Will the coalition government crumble or solidify? Traditional Republicans are voting against him. Will his unending battles waste his political capital? Or is the knockout coming? The combination of the Mueller report, Congress, impeachment, prosecution, or the 25th Amendment. And will it be that at a certain point, pretty soon, traditional Republicans decide, well, maybe Nikki Haley or Mitt Romney or Mike Pence or somebody else is better? So the tally so far, he got 2 Supreme Court justices, he got an unpopular tax cut, a damning Mueller report. His executive orders have produced little impact. 40 senior officials have been fired or resigned. He has no confirmed UN ambassador. His internal bureaucracy is in revolt. The anonymous op-ed is a good example. Almost no legislation, 2 losses on health care, travel ban litigation continues, no torture order, no withdrawal from climate. He's back to square one on North Korea. He needs the Iran deal. Trade war, destructive, indictments, plea bargains, more to come. The House of Representatives' biggest midterm loss, and it looks like another legislative loss coming soon. What this reminds me of is that famous joke by Mel Brooks, the 2,000-year-old man. He was asked, before God, was there someone else? And he said, yeah, there was a guy named Phil. And we used to say, oh, Phil, don't kick us and don't beat us and don't hurt us. And then one day, lightning came out of the sky and struck Phil dead. And we said, there's something bigger than Phil. Well, we have been absorbed with the spectacle of Trump. There's something bigger than Donald Trump. It's the law. He's only one player in this process. We all own it. We need to fight for it. We have to preserve our system. The message is not just resistance, but resilience. We can outlast him, but we need our civic institutions and our commitment to reknit our society. So the answer really is this: who speaks for America, Donald Trump and his tweets, or the rest of us? For now, the rule of law and his own incompetence have largely kept democracy in the guardrails. There is a counter strategy to preserve the world order. It's working. But for the longer term, we need to outlast him. So, what is my closing message? Yeah, the constitutional cathedral is burning. It's scary. But like Notre Dame, our system is still standing. It's still standing. The basics are still there. Yes, it's under attack. Yes, the guardrails are fraying. It can be rebuilt. Rebuilding it, as in France rebuilding Notre Dame, is critical to our sense of national identity and our commitment to the rule of law that defines us as a nation. Human rights and the rule of law is what defines us as a nation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all persons are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among them the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. We are a diverse nation that is held together by those values. If we don't fight for those values, we don't have an identity as a nation. So, we have to fight to save the cathedral. And ask yourself, in that process, what role will each of you play? Will you be a bystander? In which case, the more active person wins. Will you be one of the firefighters? Will you be one of the rebuilders? We all have to take a stand. I know that many of you are doing so many things here in Boulder. I know that our dean, Jim Anaya, has done this throughout his career. I know that the humanists take this as part of their core mission. I'm happy to come here to talk to you about it on this historic day, which may, I think, be a turning point in many of these things. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have. Yeah, okay. I'll take one or two, yeah.
Okay, so we're running out of time, but let's take one question. Our tradition is to call on a student first.
Yeah.
And we have one there in the back. Jordan, how about? Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Professor Coe. My name is Jordan. I'm a 2L here at CU, CU Law. Very interesting talk. Well, you were attempting to draw a parallel between Iran and North Korea. You left out a pretty critical fact that pretty much negates the entire parallel you were trying to create, which is that North Korea has been testing nuclear weapons since 2006. So when you say that Trump would be lucky to get an eighth of the Iran deal, I actually agree with you. That would be great. So I'd love to hear your perspective on how you would actively engage in denuclearization talks with a country that is already nuclear capable. Because as far as I'm aware, no nation has ever given up their nuclear weapons other than voluntarily. So yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
Well, you just gave the answer to your own question. You know, Libya gave up nuclear weapons voluntarily, subject to negotiation. No nation has given up nuclear weapons under threat of force. The mistake was made when we left North Korea in 2000, because at that point, North Korea had no nuclear weapons. What happened was that the successor administration, Bush administration, over the objection of George H.W. Bush, Brent Scowcroft, Colin Powell, and others, broke off the six-party talks. And then the North Koreans started building weapons. And they then recommissioned their nuclear power plants. Now, the obvious answer is, we won't talk to you until you start to decommission. You know, I mean, if Kim Jong-un wants to put some skin on the table, he should decommission the Yongbyon power plant. And by the way, the Iran nuclear deal says, okay, if you want to have peaceful uses of nuclear energy, we'll consider that. But this should be a multilateral negotiation that includes the Japanese, the South Koreans, the Chinese. The idea of having two bilateral talks, Trump talking to the North Koreans about peace, about nukes, and the South Koreans talking to the North Koreans about peace and reunification is not going to work. These are related issues. Now, obviously, to get the nuclear weapons down from 60, which is what they are, to much less, will require a lot of discussion, which is why, before you even meet, you ask them to destroy weapons or put a standstill on new weapons. He didn't ask for any of that. You also asked for a standstill on cyber. Or, if he's going to do cyber, say, if you want to have cyber capability comparison, the United States cyber capacity is worth, release real political prisoners. The only difference between the two situations is that the United States let the North Korean situation advance. When I left North Korea in December 2000, I asked our nuclear expert, Bob Einhorn, how many weapons do they have? He said 0. I said, how many do they want? He said, they want 5. And I said, why do they want 5? And he said, 1 to target Seoul, 1 to target Tokyo, 1 to target Beijing, 1 to arm with an intercontinental ballistic missile if they can develop it to hit Hawaii, and 1 to sell to Al-Qaeda. Well, that was the point at which you had to intensify the talks so that they didn't get any. That's when you should have done the Iran nuclear deal in the first place. And instead, the George W. Bush administration broke off the talks. When you break off the talks, there's no disincentive, because these guys are not stupid. They know if they're going to go into a negotiation, you want more poker chips on the table. And the way you get more poker chips is you do what they can do, which is build weapons without transparency. You know, so Trump has gotten absolutely nothing, less than nothing. We would be better off if he had had no discussions with them. And the illusion that he's creating progress by legitimating a tin pot dictator. Look at the amount of legitimacy Kim Jong-un, Mohammed bin Salman, Rodrigo Duterte, Erdogan, Xi Jinping, and Putin have drawn from their various bilateral engagements with Trump. You know, all of them make the American president look bad and make America look bad. And in the eyes of the world, who are you going to throw in your lot in with under these circumstances? And then he breaks the deals that actually bring people on our side. He breaks the TPP. He breaks the Iran nuclear deal. He breaks the Paris Climate Agreement. So this is someone who is throwing away our goodwill and getting absolutely nothing for it. This is just terrible deal making. Now, here's a basic point. So obvious that it's almost something I shouldn't have to say. The world is not about deals. It's about relationships. Trump's major failure is he doesn't understand that our relationships are what sustain us. So there is a cost to insulting NATO, and there is a cost to making people think we're an unreliable partner on climate. And there is a cost to all of these activities. And there is a cost to having people think that we're soft on Russia. Like the Ukrainians have absolutely no idea what's going to happen next. We're entering into an amazing situation now, which is that Ukraine is in the middle of their election, and a comedian is leading as president. It's like Stephen Colbert in role. He campaigned. We could end up with the president of Ukraine being a comedian and the president of the United States being Donald Trump. And is that going to bode well for whether the United States can resist the next steps of aggression vis-a-vis Ukraine? So this is my point. If there is a long-term strategy that works, it is engage, translate, and leverage. And the engagement should be through multilateral engagement, because these problems are too big for us to solve by ourselves or to do it through bilateral deals. And withdrawing has unbelievable consequences. That's what the Brits learned. You know, their politicians told them, leave. And then when they actually saw what would happen if they did leave, they started to realize what an incredible disaster it was because of transnational law. International law is woven into the fiber of their domestic being. It's like ripping out all of the red threads of a multicolored tapestry. It destroys all of these relationships. You know, I've been a visiting professor in Cambridge, England for the last year. They have 1 day of supplies at Dover. If the UK leaves the EU, they have to hire 1,000 toll takers. You know, Oxford and Cambridge are going to lose 30% of their student body because of visa restrictions. You know, between Northern Ireland and Ireland is a single electronic grid. These relationships are going to be just severed by this amazingly counterproductive decision in the name of sovereignty. The UK will be reduced to the status of, say, Dubai, as just a powerful business city, London and Dubai. That's a form of suicide. And it all comes from the fact that people don't appreciate the value of these relationships.
Thank you, Professor Coe, for a terrific talk and very thought-provoking. Please join us for reception in the Becher Hall, and thanks for coming.